Western Governors University has been around for about 15 years. In fact, we just celebrated our 15th year anniversary. And we have now about 40,000 students in all 50 states in the U.S. The main thing we're doing right now is championing competency-based learning and providing access to this learning model for lots of students, and then helping a lot of other universities and community colleges model the kind of work that we're doing. It's hard sometimes for people to get their minds around the notion of competency-based or learning-centered education, and part of our mission is to help show folks the way. You know what's interesting is people calling the flipped classroom new. It's really not new. People were doing versions of the flipped classroom in the 1970s with videotape lectures and the rest. What really is now is that we have access to some of the absolute best of the best people in their professions and in their academic stations that we can make accessible to learners of all different shapes and sizes. So for me, when I think about my 4 kids, I think about my son Richard, who is really big into math and science in particular. The ability for him to be able to watch a lecture from Walter Lewin on physics and then to be able to process that with a teacher locally is powerful. I think the ability to be able to flip a math classroom and be able to watch the lecture on his own time and then in class actually do the homework. Because when students are stuck is when they're doing the homework and they're by themselves. And this model actually allows you to make that face time much more important and much more meaningful for that student, because they can process it with peers and they can process it when the teacher is there. So when they're stuck, they can raise their hand and somebody can come over who's not their parent pulling their hair out because they don't understand the concepts the student is learning at that given moment. Oh, there's no one size fits all day for the work at Western Governors, and especially the work of a chancellor. Most of our work is really championing this model of education and opening the doors of access for students. And so it's a combination of meeting and collaborating and connecting with students, and also working with other education partners and business partners. I think what has been really good for Western Governors University is we in general are serving a market that is not being served by other folks in a pretty significant way. So for example, the traditional university is focused on 18 to 22-year-old students that are coming right out of high school. That's less than 3% of our student population. We are really focused on our modal student is really between 25 and 55, our average age is in the high 30s, and we're typically finding an incumbent worker who wants to get that next degree so they can go to the next level of their job, or a displaced worker who wants to get a degree to move to another job, or a transfer student who needs some kind of flexibility on their education pathway. And for us, that's a pretty significant market. And in particular, we are incredibly well suited to serve the some college and no credential crowd. And so in the U.S., a country of more than 300 million folks, we have about 37 million people with significant college coursework and no credential. So for us to be able to reach out to that market, if we touch 1% of that market, we're massively successful. So in many ways, we are not a threat to the traditional universities or community colleges. We're actually more of a partner in terms of bringing folks into the education space. My position is basically the idea that we should try to find credentials that have labor market value. And to me, the data that shows that credentials with labor market value, apprenticeships, certifications, diplomas, and degrees are the ones that should carry the day. And they're ones, and labor, what's interesting is people think that suddenly means you're vocationalizing education, that you don't care about the liberal arts. The irony of ironies is behind all of that is that it is actually the world of industry that is saying, for the love of God, give us students who can critically think, who are creative, who can work in teams, who have the ability to actually solve what Chris Dede at Harvard would call wicked problems. And so for us, the notion of labor market valued credentials really matter. What concerns us are credentials that don't count. Credentials that don't really carry that value, because that doesn't help a student on their pathway to possibility. Now, one of the things I want to predicate all that with is the fact that there are some folks who go on education pathways who are not looking for it to be a job placement. They don't want to actually move into a career. What they're really doing it for is because they want to learn something significant. So a good example is we had a graduate about a month ago in our first commencement ceremony at WGU Texas who was 80 years old. And the gentleman said he had promised his mother that he would get his master's degree. And so he didn't want to get a job, but he wanted to learn that material and master that concept. So for him, it was about actually self-efficacy and kind of completing a goal that he wanted to achieve. I think there's a host of things that are happening right now. I think one, we talked about today, the notion of tuning the blend, of using human learning science to tune online and blended learning, which I think is a significant movement. And people are getting, what I really like about it is it's no longer hype about how powerful online learning is. It is actual hard-nosed data analysis to say what improves learning on ground, online, and in the blend. And I think that's going to be a good movement for years to come. I think the shift to digital curricular resources and figuring out the way we can tune those and actually create master playlists for the different learning experiences we have and the courses that we have. And I think big data is going to be a big deal. I think what you're going to see is people being able to turn into data use and be able to actually get data to students, to teachers, to help them navigate learning journeys more effectively. I think much like the music industry, we'll live through some tumultuous years as the business model emerges, but I think we'll end up in a healthy mix of open content and paid content, just like the music industry does. People will pay a premium for highly produced, high-structured, high-quality content, and they'll also be drawn to the open content. And I think the biggest challenge is going to be curation. How do you curate together the best of build, buy, share? The curriculum you build yourself, that you buy from publishers, and that you share in the open content space. I'm quite excited about the open content space because it will provide access to curricular resources at a really low cost point, if not no cost point, especially for the developing world. And at the same time having the paid content movement driven by good folks at Pearson and Cengage and McGraw-Hill and Wiley, who are more than willing to kind of begin to digitize and make more digitally native their curricular resources. It's going to be rowdy, and we have to figure out the business model, and I don't think anybody has it situated yet, but it's going to be an interesting time for us to live through. I do think that at the end of the day, the biggest challenge for us is figuring out how we effectively curate those resources and then get really tough-minded about what works and what doesn't to help those students learn. No, we actually have a deeply personal model. So there's a myth that people assume that because you're online, one, that you're for-profit. We're not, we're nonprofit. They also assume because you're online, you must use massive amounts of adjunct faculty and visiting faculty and exploit them for low cost. We don't. We have all full-time faculty. And the third is they assume that you're impersonal, that you must just be doing correspondence online. Our faculty members, we have two kinds of core kinds of faculty members, student mentors and faculty and course mentors. The student mentors carry a caseload of students from first contact all the way through to the time they cross the stage. It's an Oxford model online. It is weekly contact with those students to help them go all the way through their education journey. And then we have course mentors who are PhD specialists in their discipline who come in and out of that student's life based on what they're studying. And it's the matrix of those two faculty members that actually guide the student through their educational journey. So it's a deeply personal connection. And every week those students are talking with faculty either on video chat, so either video streaming or over a conference call, but it's a personal conversation. And so by the time they get done with that educational journey, they are deeply connected with the faculty at our place, which leads to some pretty powerful moments at commencements. One of the things I loved about our keynote plenary was the mix of the work of Pearson and the work of the filmmakers. And I think the yin and the yang of kind of the art and the science of this work is probably what's going to be exciting going forward. And I love the idea of kind of being able to tell stories and have what my fellow keynoter said, the space between the notes, to be able to kind of let this music come together is exactly right. So for me, I think it's the coming together of the art and the science of this, which is going to make it exciting on the road ahead.